Greetings. Welcome to The Point Being, the Ipsos Public Polling Podcast. We're back after a long hiatus in a new format to take advantage of these COVID Teams Skype meeting times. I am proud to be joined by my co-host, Mallory Newall, and new contributors to the program, Kate Morris and Sarah Feldman.
Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Happy to be on video in the land of Zoom meetings.
That's right. It's the new normal, as they say. So we have done a lot of research since we were last with you. We're not going to try to go through all of it today because it'll be a long podcast if we did. But you can definitely find it all on our website, ipsos.com. We've been doing a lot of work on coronavirus. We've been doing a lot of work on the election. We've been doing a lot of work on the economy. Recently, we've been doing a lot of work on the protests that have erupted around the country that we'll talk about in a little bit. But as we get into that, Mallory, why don't you just give us a level set of where America is right now? What are the vital statistics?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Right now, according to our latest Ipsos Reuters polling, nearly 2/3 of Americans feel that the country is headed off on the wrong track. That's been pretty consistent with numbers that we saw pre-pandemic, pre-protest. So generally, the mood hasn't worsened too much since everything started taking place, but the mood is certainly not good at the present either. In terms of where we're at for the election, because reminder to everyone, there is a presidential election in just a couple months from now. Our latest polling shows Joe Biden, the presumptive, if not now official, because he's got the delegates locked up, nominee, with an 8-point lead among registered voters over President Trump, consistent with what we've seen in some other public polls released recently. And in terms of President Trump, his approval rating, which we've noted on this podcast is sort of notoriously steady and not easily moved, is currently at 39% among all Americans. So it is slightly, very slightly, below that general low to mid 40% range that we often cite on the podcast if you've been a long-time listener. And his approval rating on COVID specifically tracks really closely with his approval rating generally. So what that tells me is that people really aren't separating out how they feel about him overall and the job he's doing versus how they feel about the job he's doing with the pandemic specifically.
Yeah, and we did see Trump's approval rating go up ever so slightly in late March when the White House first started tackling the pandemic, but then it sort of slid a little bit. And then particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, he's slid from 42, 43 down to the 39 we see him today. Pretty much right at the same time we saw the nationwide protests starting that we'll get into at more length in a few minutes.
That's right. There's certainly the rally around the flag effect that we talked about. And, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, when Trump was talking about being a wartime president, I think the question of if people see him as a wartime president or a depression president, we're kind of moving a little bit toward the latter with all of the growing unrest and all of the ongoing issues with the pandemic that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, that's right.
And along the lines of the pandemic, before we jump too far into some COVID and protest-specific research, I do just want to note that over the past couple of months, we've seen an interesting shift in what people perceive as the main problem facing the nation. Prior to the pandemic, it was healthcare. And now we've actually moved into a spot where almost 1 in 3 Americans feel that the economy and jobs is the main problem facing the nation.
That's right.
Go ahead, Chris.
And that level, though, while certainly the main issue is nothing like we saw in 2009, 2010 after the Great Recession, where it was 2 in 3, basically twice as many Americans saw the economy and jobs as the main issue. So it's interesting, even though the recession is worse in a lot of ways than it was in 2010, unemployment certainly much higher, people aren't necessarily feeling it quite the same way. It's an interesting sort of comparison to that point 10 years ago.
So Kate, can you dive into a little bit more about perceptions around the economy right now and what our data is showing?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, there are demonstrations roiling the country, and the coronavirus is still very much present. But at the same time, Ipsos's consumer sentiment numbers show that Americans continue to become increasingly confident about where they are now at 52.9%, 52.9. And more interestingly, looking ahead, they are incredibly confident about their future and what the economy might bring for them. So it's actually the highest it's ever been at 69.9. That's the expectations index.
So,
And
so that expectations index is actually sort of pulling the whole thing up a little bit. People thinking things in the next 6 months are going to get so much better than they are now. Is that what's really sort of driving, we think, this really high consumer confidence level, considering, 16, 14, 15, 16% unemployment rates?
yes, I think what we're seeing is a reflection of Americans believing that the economy will bounce back quickly once restrictions lift. So at the moment, that's 52% of Americans believe that things will bounce back quickly.
Now, that's not necessarily, though, what experts have been saying, right? Like, economists believe that the damage done to the economy is going to take some time. Public health experts say that the coronavirus is not gone, that in fact we're potentially on the edge of a second wave of it. So is that necessarily realistic that people think things are going to get better so quickly?
Right, there's that tension between what kind of recovery will we be looking at? Will we see the V-shaped recovery where things kind of just get back immediately to normal as though there were never a pandemic at all, or will it be a slower U-shaped recovery? And also even a bumpier one if the coronavirus does come back in earnest and shut things down again. So it's hard to
So
say.
It's interesting because we have such bullish sentiments for some about the economy and kind of where it's headed next. And I think it's sort of mirrored with this almost surface level optimism about how quickly we can start to leave our homes and re-enter society. And I think, Chris, that's exactly right. That's the big question. Is this real? Does public opinion match what experts are saying? And I think both from an economic perspective and a public health perspective, we're starting to see some signs in the data that they don't exactly align.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Kate, you were telling us just before we got started that those expectations aren't symmetrical across the population, that there's some groups that are being really optimistic and some groups that aren't. Can you talk a little about who's who?
Absolutely. So essentially what we're seeing is what we imagine would be Trump's base, who are the most optimistic. And that's been pretty consistent from over the past few weeks. So Republicans, older Americans tend to be more optimistic. This week, however, we see generally across the board optimism rising in all demographics, including those who in previous weeks were less so. So Americans who are not currently employed, Democrats also tended to be less optimistic than Republicans, and we've seen an uptick in their optimism as well.
Interesting. So I guess summer's here and everything's fine. So Mallory, so we're seeing these maybe real, maybe not real expectations and some difference by party, difference by race and ethnicity, gender, age, all these sort of other fault lines in American society. Are people doing things in different ways?
They are. Summer's here, pandemic's over, let's go. I say that flippantly, but truly, we do have data showing that Americans are continuing to reemerge into society. And in general, they're seeing some normal activities like dining in at a restaurant, going to the store, going to the salon as less risky to them personally than a few weeks ago.
That's right. So our Axios index, Ipsos coronavirus index, we've been tracking behaviors around the coronavirus for the past 3 months now. And in that, we've seen, even before the protests started, people hanging out with their friends again. About half of Americans said that they visited with friends or family in the last week. We're starting to see people going out to eat again. About a quarter of Americans going out to eat. What other sort of things are we seeing Americans responding to with the coronavirus?
One thing that's really interesting is because there were, protests and outcries about this in areas across the country just maybe a month ago. Going to the salon, getting your hair cut. We're starting to see people perceiving that as less risky than a couple weeks ago. And generally the sentiment, returning to your normal pre-COVID life, that is even perceived as less risky compared to about 2 weeks ago.
That's right. Now, one thing that's come up in the last 2 weeks that may be driving normal activities being seen as less risky are the protests we've seen across the country in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. What does the Axios survey tell us about what people think about the impact of that on their risk of coronavirus infection?
I'm glad that you brought that up, Chris. It's interesting because many people perceive the protests as being personally risky and actually something that concerns them about a potential second surge for the coronavirus. We've got nearly 9 in 10 Americans saying that attending a protest or a demonstration is a large or moderate risk to their health. And I think about half are concerned about a spike in cases as a direct result of these protests. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting because right now we're at a time where people had started becoming more and more comfortable with reemerging. And then the murder of George Floyd happened, and now we've started to see thousands of protests pop up all across the country. And at the same time, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So there's a question, I think, about how much risk you're willing to take on to resume activities in your normal life, which seems to be like a little bit more, right? But then how much risk you're willing to take on when it comes to actively participating in these protests and demonstrations about racial inequality. And that right now is sort of where the big level of risk lives.
That's right. And the Axios survey showed that about 1 in 10 Americans had somebody in their inner circle that took part in the protests. And about 2% of Americans, at least in the survey, said that they took part in the protests. 2% may not sound like a lot, but if that actually holds up, that's about 5 million people, which is pretty massive in terms of the number of people. So speaking of the protests, though, we just released today, this morning, in USA Today, 2 pieces of research on the waves of protest. Mallory, what's sort of the top line from those studies?
Sure. So from the USA Today poll that we released today, I think one of the most interesting findings is that the American public is really split on whether it's more important to protect law and order or more important to protect the right of protesting. Like down the middle, even percentages across the board. And we're seeing with that question, as well as pretty much every single question in this survey, vast differences based on race and ethnicity, huge gulfs of difference in public opinion between white Americans and Black Americans, and huge differences in partisanship as well. So in one camp, you have Democrats and you have Black Americans and other people of color who are supportive of the right to protest. And over here, you have white Americans and Republicans who want to prioritize law and order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when you just ask sort of a straightforward question, do you support the protests? Are you sympathetic with the protesters? We get a clear majority who say yes, who say they are supportive, 2/3 of Americans about, depending on exactly how you ask the question. But when you get to sort of the harder issue, which I think is we've seen the Trump administration talking about of law and order versus protests, even if it causes damage or destruction or there's violence in it, that's where you get that split you were just talking about. And I think that's interesting because that split, I think, really illustrates the sort of the fault line in society right now and how we are in many ways divided 50-50. But, I don't think that this is just necessarily a Democrat-Republican issue, because we've seen these protests erupt across the country. And Sarah, I know you've been working with a team that's been actually collecting data on that. What do we know about how these protests have really taken place in the last 2 weeks?
That's exactly right, Chris. What we know is that this is happening. These protests are occurring in both cities, towns, and villages across the country. I mean, while there's been a ton of media attention around major cities like New York, LA, Chicago, collecting this data, we know that there's numerous protests happening across the country, and many of these local protesters are tagging on their own George Floyds, their own local martyrs or people who have been murdered by the police onto the national narrative, really making it a local issue. And it just goes to show just how this issue permeates throughout the US. In the vein of the divisions in the country regarding how people trust different institutions, different people when it comes to racial justice and their ability to promote justice in the country right now, we see major divisions. The USA Today poll shows major divisions between Black Americans and white Americans on this issue. Black Lives Matter, while it has become a household name throughout these protests, at both like the town and city level, we are seeing major divisions by race. Only half of white Americans would trust Black Lives Matter to promote justice and equal treatment for people of all races, while 87% of Black Americans feel that trust towards that movement. And we see similar divisions, of course, for local police and law enforcement and for protesters as well. While most people do sympathize, as you said, Chris, with peaceful protesters, what percent of protests they believe are peaceful, who is organizing these protests, really start to divide people on who they're trusting and where they're putting engendering that trust towards.
Yeah, and I think that's actually another good point. One of the other things from the USA Today poll, I don't know, Mallory, if you were planning to mention this, was that perception of if the protests have been mostly peaceful or mostly not peaceful. Yeah. And that too, there was a almost even split where, people, about half of people thought they were mostly peaceful and about half of people thought they were mostly not peaceful. And again, it had that typical that you'd expect partisan difference where Democrats were much more likely to think the protests were peaceful and Republicans were much more likely to think they were not.
Yeah, that's something that's interesting, right? Because that is a split here, though we do see slightly more people coming down on the side of feeling that protests have been mostly peaceful. And that's something that we at Ipsos have actually been mapping and tracking, is protests that have had observable violence or not. And we know that most of them have been peaceful. But for some Americans, and we see this in our poll, we see that there's actually a really important distinction. They're willing to support peaceful protests, but not violent protests or looting. So it's almost like for certain Americans, they sort of see some of these actions as okay, but there's a hard line in the sand for them.
Yeah, that's right. And we know from the mapping data that you and Sarah were just talking about that as best that we can tell, about 2/3 of the protests, a little over 2/3 of the protests in that first weekend in late May were peaceful. They sort of no altercations with police, no property damage, no violence or anything else like that. And then as we've sort of moved forward in time, they've gotten increasingly peaceful. So that now actually it's 95% of the protests that are occurring in a peaceful fashion. So that the total among all the protests are a bit over 4/5 have not had any sort of altercations in them, which sort of suggests there was sort of a moment at the beginning where there was a significant amount of violence or damage that was conducted, but since then it really hasn't happened. But even though we're still seeing a substantial number of Americans believing these protests were mostly violent. Anything else from the USA Today poll that is worth referencing, Mal?
Well, the last thing I'll end on, to bring it back full circle to kind of where we're at with current leadership and current perceptions of the country, we also asked Americans who they thought of the current and former all living presidents would be best equipped to handle the unrest we're seeing right now. And nearly half said President Barack Obama. President Trump was cited by 20% of Americans, so there's a pretty big difference here. President Trump also falls to the bottom of the list when you ask people how much they trust him to promote justice and equal treatment for people of all races. Not even half of white Americans trust President Trump to promote justice and equality. So just wanted to note that as sort of, perceptions of the general mood of the country and how that might be feeding into perceptions of the president's approval rating and views toward him overall right now.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So you can find this USA Today Ipsos study on our website, also the Axios and Reuters studies we talked about earlier, in addition to the analysis Kate and Sarah have been producing, including the interactive map of protests. Very cool stuff. You can also always follow us on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JCB Jackson.
I'm at Mallory Kate, and that's Kate with a C.
And I'm at Callison Morris.
And you can always email us at thepointbeing@ipsos.com. We'll try to be back in less than 4 months for the next one. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for viewing and listening.